Okay. Taal Levi is an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. He was trained in physics and biology at UC Berkeley and went on to receive a PhD in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz. He has a diverse research interest in wildlife ecology, conservation biology, and disease ecology in tropical, temperate, and boreal ecosystems on which he has authored over 80 scientific publications. A consistent theme of his research is the implementation of quantitative and molecular methods to applied ecology and conservation issues. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Dr. Levi, and I will let you take it away from here.
All right, thanks for having me. Let's see if we can get this working on the first try. Success?
Yep.
All right. Okay, well, I'm excited to talk to you all today, and sort of audibled with permission to talk not just about bears, but about linkages between terrestrial carnivores and aquatic resources in general. And so there'll be a play in 3 acts here. So hopefully that's not too loud. So I just wanted to start by taking us to a salmon stream. And we were watching this bear come up towards these king salmon that were spawning. And I just love to see this interaction. It's a happy bear. That fourth cub really does it for me. So happy bears eating lots of salmon, having large litter sizes in these salmon systems. Act 2 is going to be about coastal wolves in Southeast Alaska, and Act 3 about aquatic jaguars in the Brazilian Pantanal. All right, so let's get started with bears. This was mostly master's work that Lori Hare did and Yasman Shakeri. And then Jennifer Allen is the lab manager that did a lot of the genetics work. And so the way I think about bears in the American West is it's really borrowing from how we think about wolves in terms of what do we lose from the ecosystem when we lost wolves. And I think we don't often reflect on just how many places had bears not very long ago, had brown bears not very long ago, into the 20th century, and how few places still have them. And bears are not just this feature of the American West. In the West, we might have brown bears that are still extant in much of northwestern Canada and Alaska, but in places we don't have brown bears, we might have American black bears or Asiatic black bears, but there's a large swath of the former range of brown bears where they no longer exist. And in plenty parts of their current range, they're much reduced densities. So a lot of what I've been thinking about is why do we care about having brown bears, and what does having lots of brown bears on the landscape do? And the primary way you get lots of brown bears is by having lots of food. And that food can be seasonally available because brown bears can hibernate. So they can use a seasonally available food source to put on lots of fat and then just sleep during the energetically limiting period, whereas a lot of other animals have populations that might be limited by the leanest part of the year if they don't have the same fat deposition capability. So what does it mean to have high bear densities in these salmon systems? And it's not so easy to estimate population density of bears, but we've got a number of sites where dietary meat, which is almost exclusively salmon, in many systems versus population density. And what I want you to look at is just how wide this variability is. That you've got lots of systems where bear densities are relatively low, and then systems where there's just lots of salmon availability where they reach high density. And if you look at a salmon spawning ground, like whether it's a small pink salmon stream like this is near our cabin way back in the day, the thing you notice is that activity on these streams is really bear dominated. Other things show up, especially interested in scavenging off of bears, like marten or mink coming up here. But there's no bait here. There's just a camera on a stream, and this is just a few days of watching. So incredibly common to see these things here. And it's also true on lake shores where sockeye spawn. So on the bottom, you can see the date. So we're just watching August 21st, now August 22nd. And we just have to watch the Cubs play. We'll repeat that one. Okay, so I want to talk about 4 things regarding bears and how having lots of bears might influence ecosystems. The first one is subsidies that they provide to vertebrate and invertebrate scavengers. I want to talk about competition with other carnivores, predation, and seed dispersal, which is the main thing we've done field research on. So starting with subsidies, this is probably the most well-studied thing that the bear-salmon interaction is responsible for. This whole salmon in the forest or salmon for the forest idea. But essentially the idea is that salmon are often not available to the terrestrial community because they're in water. Bears remove them, like this chum salmon with the head consumed. So bears are sometimes high grading on the most energetically rich portions of the fish and depositing them for terrestrial vertebrates and invertebrates. Or this pink salmon with just the eggs removed and the carcass left. And they do this in periods when salmon are really abundant and they can high grade on the most nutritious parts of the fish. So we put cameras on carcasses that bears had deposited, and you see lots of things show up like marten or mink, or even owls. You can maybe see in the background here, there's a bear. Almost seems like this owl is just waiting for a bear to deposit a fish. You can watch this over the course of a few days. This is the edge of a pool where sockeye are spawning. And there's a point where a bear leaves a little bit of a sockeye salmon carcass. You kind of get the feeling that just bears are here all day, every day. There it is. Immediately while the bear's still there, the ravens clean it up. Okay, so it's not just vertebrate scavengers that are supported, but we can use stable isotope analysis, the idea that you are what you eat. And sort of like how metals bioaccumulate, heavier isotopes of carbon and nitrogen can bioaccumulate as you move up trophic levels. So we've got whole suites of invertebrates that are primarily terrestrial herbivorous insects, or invertebrates, not just insects, I suppose. And then the predators of those things. But then you've got a whole suite of invertebrates that are salmon eating. So if you look at these carcasses, probably many of you have seen this, they might be swarming with maggots, but there's more than just fly larvae in there. There's also burying beetle larvae, and there's this really interesting thing where these burying beetles, they want to deposit their eggs in these carcasses and have these beetle grubs that are much larger than fly larvae get born, but it's hard for them to colonize before these carcasses are overwhelmed by maggots. And so they carry these mites with them that attack fly larvae, maggots, but not beetle larvae. And these two things live their life cycle together. So their offspring are born along with the generation time of mites and go from carcass to carcass, reproducing. Okay, and then you have the things that eat salmon-eating invertebrates. So there's vertebrates that are depending on salmon carcasses deposited by bears, but also invertebrates in this system that really benefit. So I think that's been relatively well studied, but people haven't thought very much about salmon grow lots of brown bears. What does that mean for competition? And one reason we think it should mean a lot is that when we put cameras on salmon streams versus roads and trails, this is in northern Southeast Alaska near Haines. This is the relative encounter rate. Can you see my mouse when I have it here? I'll assume so, but let me know if you can't.
Yes, we can.
You can, okay. So brown bears were by far the most common thing on salmon spawning grounds, and you've seen the videos, right? They're just dominating. Every once in a while we see a wolf or a coyote, but black bears were actually the most common species in the same region on roads and trails. So there's really unambiguous exclusion of black bears from salmon spawning grounds, because we know from many other sites, black bears consume lots and lots of salmon, spend a lot of time on streams. There are systems where they can feed on the same streams at the same time. For reasons unknown to me, this is not one of them. Some of this partitioning is happening at biogeographical scale. So if you look at the Southeast Alaska landscape, actually, and British Columbia, it's archipelagic, and you've got these different predator community motifs. So on the mainland, most of the land here really, you've got brown bears, black bears, and wolves that can feed on some ungulate, more moose to the north, and more deer through most of the region, but also salmon and either vegetation and berries, depending on, vegetation and berries. So this is what the food web mostly looks like, right? There's some other things being consumed, but it's salmon, ungulates, and veg for these bears, and salmon and ungulates for wolves. But there's these so-called ABC islands of Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof, these large islands, which have only brown bears. And it's unknown exactly why these islands don't have wolves or black bears. What is it about it? It's certainly not dispersal, because wolves are the best dispersers of these three. They live on small islands, far offshore. They can even swim island to island and be these sort of sea wolf lifestyles. So I think it's likely that bears are kleptoparasites of wolves. So wolves might kill a deer, and bears are on it relatively quickly. So we have motif A, these bear islands. In contrast, the black bear islands, all of these always have wolves. So the islands either fall into a black bear wolf island or a brown bear island. And then there's some locations here and probably some of these other distal islands that have only wolves. Okay, and so this motif is also followed in East Asia, where you've got brown bear islands or black bear islands, but not both. So competition is likely to play a key role, and resource subsidies from aquatic systems supporting abundant black bears probably plays a role in mediating this competition. And I think this is a super interesting avenue for future research. And like I said earlier, seed dispersal is the thing we've primarily researched, but I wanted to review all of these different facets of what it means to have lots of salmon supported brown bears. So predation is another one, and it's pretty hard to think about. Predation is a big topic in Alaska because subsistence hunting is so important. It's such a big deal that the state engages in, well, especially wolf control, but for a while, especially brown and black bear control in some select locations, like near the town of McGrath, or in the Susitna near Anchorage here, where there's a larger black bear control area and this smaller, this horizontal lines here, brown bear area. So the state's actively managing for reduced bear density, and probably the primary way they do this is by liberalizing the harvest, by increasing the hunting season. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but from the 70s to the late 2010s, it's become such that it used to be that there were no places with more than 100 days of hunting, and now most places have at least 200 days of hunting. Other trends are things like increased bag limits or being allowed to hunt brown bears over bait. So the state's actively managing for reduced bear density, and I think it's a good idea to start thinking about why we care about having a lot of bears. And I should say this is mostly not in salmon systems. It's mostly in the interior with some exceptions. Okay, so one thing we thought would be cool to do is actually find all of the moose calf survival data we could and all of the bear density data we could. And this mostly comes from Alaska Department of Fish and Game, unpublished studies, collated with Alaska Department of Fish and Game collaborators. And one interesting thing is that at very low bear densities, there tends to be, or there's some signal of high moose calf survival. And these data points mostly come from predator control studies where they actively reduce bear density, and they have these paired points. But the other interesting thing is we only have one big salmon system, Berners Bay, and another system with salmon, Gustavus here. And moose calf survival is not lower. Berners here, we don't have high bear density, in part because we don't have any data on black bear density, which we know in the system is even higher than brown bear density. So I think that point is way out here. But still, moose calf survival tends to be around 20% for a large variation in bear density. So you can imagine reducing bear density might have very little effect unless you get it to very low densities. Okay. The other thing that we wanted to know is, given these different predator community motifs here, do we have any observed variation in deer density? Like, so are deer densities potentially higher in these bear systems, brown bear systems, where brown bears are excluding black bears and wolves? And so for that, we use this really good data set that Alaska Department of Fish and Game collects on deer pellet groups. So they've got long time series and many survey routes on some of these islands. And so I've colored the bars, I've colored the bars here based on whether they're primarily brown bear islands, or which in these cases they're exclusively brown bear islands, or primarily black bear islands. And I say primarily only because brown bears are starting to colonize some of these islands. But the key result here is that pellet groups per plot are consistently higher in brown bear islands than in black bear islands. And that's an index of abundance. And the other index of abundance is places that it takes fewer days for a hunter to kill a deer. We assume these places also have higher deer density. So days of hunting per deer is lower on the brown bear islands than the black bear islands. So I think there's something going on here where salmon support abundant bears, brown bears. Brown bears exclude black bears and wolves from these islands, and that provides higher deer density. So these are the sort of interesting species interactions that I think require further study. And finally, seed dispersal, something I've been interested in for a long time. Started my PhD years ago working in the Amazon on primates and seed dispersal and monkey hunting. So this is an interesting ecological process because plants don't have feet, right? They need somebody like a bear or the wind to move their seeds for them. And so this is a mutualism because it benefits both the plant and the seed disperser. You probably have most of these things in your neck of the woods right now. We particularly study this plant, Devil's Club, but all of these are pretty abundant in our study area. Devil's Club is the dominant understory shrub in our part of northern Southeast Alaska. It's quite abundant. But high bush cranberry, red osier dogwood, blueberry are all pretty common. Okay, and one reason we study Devil's Club is it has this big infractescence that you can monitor more easily. I'll show you the two ways we do it. So here's where we are in northern Southeast Alaska. Each of these X's or T's here are infractescences that we were monitoring over 2 years. So sometimes we monitor them with the camera a little bit further away, but usually the camera was closer. This just happened to be a patch where you could see quite a few of them. And it's pretty amazing to see brown bears just take down hundreds of fruits at once in these infractescences, each with 2 seeds. So that's a lot of seeds that were just consumed by this bear. The smaller bodied black bear, by comparison, they eat more like corn on the cob. And so we don't want to preferentially select for fruit that is accessible to bears. So even when they're really high, they can get on their hind legs and bring those infractescences down. This tends to be under the canopy, this fruit up higher like that. So we also see birds. Often after bears have already consumed, there'll be this like rosette that still remains that bears can perch on and consume remaining berries. So ultimately, we want to know, are bears the primary seed disperser of these fruit, or are birds, which one would assume based on small red berries? The assumption is bird dispersed, but I think the way that they're clustered makes them pretty ideal for bears that want to just take lots of volume at once. The other thing we were interested in is among the bears, is it primarily male or female bears or brown or black bears? And so we run a genetics lab here and we swabbed these infractescences. This allowed us to really increase our sample size. So you can see that this one's flagged with flagging tape. And so we drive around, visit all the sites, and if a bear had consumed, which you can tell really there's just a stalk left, we'd swab it for bear saliva to identify the sex and species of bear that consumed it. So I'll show you results in two ways. We wanted to be conservative, and so we multiplied the bird number of berries we saw birds consumed by 5 based on an experiment with bird feeders, where we put cameras on bird feeders to see what's like the most berries we could miss. And so what I want you to take away from this is that birds were dispersing way more Devil's Club than were birds, and brown bears more than black bears. Both of those, I think, generally defy conventional wisdom about black bears being more frugivorous or more vegetarian than our brown bears, although of course they both depend on berries quite a lot. But we saw the same thing with DNA. So this is the number of infractescences, so Devil's Club fruits that where we saw black bears, and the number where we saw brown bears, and whether they were male and black or female and gray. So female brown bears consume the most Devil's Club. There were some other interesting things. Most berries or most seeds go undispersed. And this especially was the case in year 2, because in year 1, there was a spruce mast. And we had a small mammal project I might talk about just briefly. In year 2, after that spruce mast, red squirrels were really abundant, and they were the primary visitor to these infractescences. In year 1, it was primarily bears. So there's interesting other dynamics going on that we didn't anticipate. And you can see that these red squirrels, they sort of mandibulate the fruits, drop the fruit, and try to take the seed. So they spend quite a bit of time trying to eat the seed itself. So these are seed predators, not seed dispersers. Okay, so we can monitor Devil's Club, but I don't think it's by any means unique, because we can monitor them because the fruit are so clustered. But if you put a camera on soapberry, where it's much harder to count what's happening, qualitatively, bears just mow down the fruit of the soapberry. And for the first part of the season, we would see birds get there before all the fruit were ripe. But once at the patch level, there's just lots of ripe fruit. Bears are just here. And I think part of why they hit soapberries so hard is that in our system, they're the first plants to have fruit. And so it's all of a sudden this energy-rich resource where bears can just take those in. Okay, another interesting thing about seed dispersal by bears, this is a little bit of a complex figure, but we've got date on the x-axis. And the key thing here is the color of these points. So when they're this like orangish color, that's a brown bear that we observed eating that fruit, Devil's Club in this case. And when it's these blue triangles, that's black bear. And so elevation is where we had this thing to see if there's anything that's covariant with elevation, or maybe they're partitioning, but we didn't see that effect very clearly. Gray here are the 2 dates in the 2 years of monitoring that was the peak of entrance to Chilkat Lake, where sockeye spawn, or actually multiple salmon species spawn, to give you an idea of when salmon become available on the landscape. So the assumption we're making is that peak entry into the river is about the same time that there's salmon actually on spawning grounds doing their thing. So what I think is interesting about this is that it's pretty much overwhelmingly dominated by brown bears. Devil's Club consumption is early in the season. And then there's this switch around the time of salmon where black bears become the dominant thing we observed. So I think that's quite interesting. The idea being that when brown bears move on to feed on salmon, that opens up all these Devil's Club patches to black bears. And so salmon might be one way that these species are coexisting by partitioning resources and time. Okay, so it doesn't seem like a great thing to be dispersed by a bear because all of your seeds end up in one place. We'll get to that in a moment, but we also want to know just how many seeds are in these scats, like how many seeds are bears dispersing. They eat a lot, they defecate a lot, especially during these periods of hyperphagia where they're really trying to put on weight. So we use the cutting edge technique of undergraduates with tweezers to count seeds in bear scats. And this is what we found. So first result is what proportion of scats contain seeds of what species. And so this is roughly consistent with the abundance of these plants. So devil's club in our system is the most abundant plant, followed by blueberry. Blueberry is especially abundant in some slightly higher elevation areas, while canopy cover is lower. Then high bush cranberry, streptopus, a kind of lily, produces these nice berries. Red osier dogwood, rose, currants, and so on. So lots of fruit. Thimbleberry is not so common in our system. It's pretty neat that they're eating bunchberry. That's this also called, it's Cornus canadensis. You see them in the forest a lot, these little small clusters of berries. And then here's a histogram for 6 of these species and pictures of what they look like that shows the number of seeds of that species per scat. And so I want to draw your attention to a few things. So we've got individual, not so common, but individual devil's club filled scats that have 80,000 seeds in them. One scat. And devil's club seeds are not trivially small the way that blueberry seeds are. Like vaccinium's got quite small seeds. Oh, that should be viburnum. The high bush cranberry, fewer seeds per scat. They have larger seeds than devil's club. But Petrum down here, I should have mentioned, individual scats can have as many as 150,000 blueberry seeds and 80,000 crowberry seeds. And crowberry is interesting because it grows up in high elevation in our study area around the alpine. And so this was a bear that was up in the alpine feeding and was able to walk all the way to our low elevation study area before we collected the scat. So I thought that was interesting as well. Okay, so these scats are huge sometimes compared to this vole here. And we've got 2 main rodents that started visiting these. So these scats were like resource hotspots, right? There are a ton of seeds available for small mammals. And we think of voles as seed predators because they hoard their seeds in these single larders, where that's not great if you're a seed. You want to be spread around. But mice bury just a few seeds, a few millimeters below the surface, and they scatter hoard them the same way that squirrels scatter hoard acorns. So there's a bunch of seeds that their whole dispersal strategy is to allow some fraction of them to feed rodents like oaks, but some fraction of them are buried by rodents and are eventually germinate and become an oak tree. So I think that secondary seed dispersal by mice in particular is this really key process that we haven't yet fully wrapped our heads around in how plants regenerate. So bears take all these seeds, deposit them in these piles, then mice rebury them and spread them around. And part of what we know about the ecology of scatter hoarding is that they unbury and rebury seeds many times. So they're constantly digging them back up and reburying them. So they can get quite distant. They also seem to be resources worth protecting. There's a little bit of a Jedi Star Wars thing going on here. The battle for bear scat. And I wanted to, so this battery here is try to make these sort of homemade, affordable, what are they called? Pit tag reader. Because this is on a small mammal trapping grid where we pit tag them because we wanted to just really quantify how much they came, but everything got destroyed. But I'm so curious if there's tunnels under the snow just still visiting these large bear scats that are deposited in the fall before the snow hits. We also observed birds foraging in bear scats, but overwhelmingly this is on a log scale, so it's 10 times more when you go up one of these things. Overwhelmingly, it was mice, especially in early successional forests like cottonwood forest, where trees are young. And in the older coniferous forest, it was still slightly more deer mice, but a lot of red-backed voles as well. And then birds, long-tailed voles, shrews, and we also saw hares, but don't think they were really foraging in the scats. But shrews certainly were. Okay, so one thing I'm interested in is, like, is this a trivial resource for mice and voles, or could this be enough nutrition that it actually affects their population dynamics? And so are these scats an ecologically relevant subsidy? And so the best we can do is some sort of back of the envelope calculation. But the first data we need is how much digestible energy is in these seeds. So we did this for fruit and seeds, but in what I'll show you, we're only dealing with seeds. You can tell that sometimes the fruit is only partially digested. So let's say what we calculate should be a little conservative, because we counted the number of seeds and we're assuming there's no energy in the fruit. Okay, so here it is for vaccinium. So it's blueberries. For bunchberry, red osier dogwood is the other cornice, devil's club, and high bush cranberry. And so basically what we can do is take the number of kilocalories per scat of digestible energy. Here's a histogram again. So a lot of scats have only about 50 kilocalories. Some scats have 450. And we can translate that into deer mice days based on the energetic requirements of mice. So some scats can support mice for about 10 or 20 days, or most of them. Every once in a while, there's a resource hotspot scat. Like this is the one that had just tons and tons of devil's club seeds that could feed one mouse for 100 days. So we can take the average here, it was a little over 100. And what's the number of deer mice days that average scat can support, and then do some back of the envelope calculation. So here's the back of the envelope. It's well, what's the bear defecation rate? What's bear density? And we want bear density specifically in low elevation areas, not in a whole basin. What's the energy per scat and the energy requirements per mouse? And then we can look at the percent of mice supported based on like how many mice are supported per square kilometer and how many mice exist per square kilometer. And we estimated that with our small mammal trapping grids and 2 vegetation types. And so there's a lot of uncertainty here, but we bracketed it by lower bear density and higher bear density. And in coniferous forests where mice are lower density, and cottonwood forests where mice are higher density. So this is a little bit busy, but the take home is that it's not 1%. Right? In places where there's a lot of mice and bear densities are lower, if you make that assumption, it's around 12%. If bear densities are higher and you're in a place with lower mouse densities, about 53% of the mice can live off of bear scats. And that's of course seasonally, but there's a thing that I want you to appreciate about this is it's not just about the number of seeds that bears are depositing in these neat little piles for mice and voles, it's also about the timing of their availability. So these devil's club seeds are going to be bound in this, high in these shrubs and not clustered until mid-September. And so for all of this time, they're not very available to small mammals. So what bears do is take all those fruit, consume the fruit, defecate out these piles of seeds, and make them available for several months prior to senescence, where those devil's clubs start to shrivel and drop their seeds. So they're concentrating them and then making them available for over 2 months prior to when they would otherwise be available. Okay, so there's a lot of little pieces of evidence we're trying to put together. And so I just think, well, how do I think this system works? And we have different levels of confidence about different things. So I know that salmon can support high bear densities and that bears are depositing these large seed piles and that small mammals use them and that seed burial can be an important process for germination and seed dispersal. It's not clear whether bears are more important than birds because it's not just about how many seeds you disperse, but how high quality is that dispersal. And I think that depends in part on how important seed burial is for germination, how important being in a sort of water retention, high nutrient area like a bear scat is for germination and rapid growth and so on. And does this matter for the plant community? I think that's an open question. So does having lots and lots of bears consuming berries and moving these seeds around help maintain systems that have lots of berry producing shrubs in the understory. The other thing we don't know is, does this matter for small mammals? Is it relevant enough that you get more small mammals or fewer small mammal crashes because there's these piles of bear scat all over? And it's just hard to imagine, if you haven't been to a place that has lots and lots of bears, just how many bear scats there can be on the landscape. It's impressive. Could any changes from salmon supported bears through small mammals influence other carnivores? I think that's an open question. And also, what we're thinking about overall here is like salmon are driving the boat. I'm interested in what it means to have high bear density, but they're also supporting these other carnivores. So I think from the perspective of how important are salmon, they tie everything together. All right, that's what I have to say about bears. And that's the majority of the talk, but I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with coastal wolves. And the Alexander Archipelago wolf subspecies is repeatedly petitioned for listing, including, again, it's currently under review. Part of the justification for listing is lots of land use change through logging and how that influences deer density. And the assumption is that the reduction of deer density by old forest logging is likely to imperil wolves. But we actually don't know that much about the biogeography of wolf diet. Like, what else are they eating? And so we, working with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, collected scats across the archipelago here and along the mainland as well. And we use a technique. So each of these little points here is a scat, and here they are again in the insets. We use a technique called DNA metabarcoding, and the basic idea is we design primers that will amplify all vertebrate DNA, and then we throw that through a high throughput sequencer, and we use the number of sequences with each unique sequence of DNA nucleotides to assign to a species. So each one of these is compared to a reference database and gives us the species out. And so going through this process, we can look at each subpopulation, what's going on with wolf diets. And so the key patterns here, I think, are that in the South, in all these populations, deer are the primary food source, but beaver and black bear are important secondary food sources in some of these systems. We've got historic data from Prince of Wales Island in particular that show bears are a key food source. There's places like Kiyu Island where there's more marine mammals, and there's moose in addition to deer. And there's places up in the north here where there are not much deer. So this is primarily mountain goat moose consuming wolf population. And then here in Douglas Island, a lot of deer, a balance of goat and wolves. But these places here is what I really want to focus on, where there's the most marine mammal consumption, especially here on Pleasant Island. They're primarily feeding on marine mammals. And so I want to dial into what marine mammals are they feeding on. And this was, we didn't start this study with where I'm about to go here, but I think it's a good example of how you just do curiosity driven research, like what are wolves doing? And that leads to new observations. And so the observation here is that those marine mammals are overwhelmingly sea otters, which were extirpated from this whole region and reintroduced in the 1960s and have then been colonizing Glacier Bay. And so in Pleasant Island in particular, they're eating stellar sea lions, harbor seals, but a lot of sea otters. This metric is a proxy for proportion of diet. So a large proportion of their diet is sea otters on Pleasant Island. Some of these other islands also have sea otters as a proportion of their diet. So here's a little bit about the history here. Reintroduction happened in 1965, and it's taken quite a while for the spread to happen. So into the 80s, they're getting through here in Icy Strait. They finally get to Pleasant Island sometime in the 2000s. And by the 2010s, they've now fully colonized Pleasant Island, and they're still moving up through Glacier Bay and now just about fully colonizing Glacier Bay. So there's ongoing recolonization after the reintroduction. But all of this in Southeast is sea otter habitat in gray. These colored regions are estimated sea otter densities going back to 2011. So not at the moment, but there hasn't been that much change in the last 10 years. And these bars are from our different wolf populations. Dark blue is proportion of their diet that's sea otter. This middle blue is ungulate, and then everything else. And we didn't think about otters when we were designing the study. So these are opportunistically collected scat, not necessarily near the coast. So I assume that the coastal wolf packs are the primary ones eating sea otters. And you see here Pleasant Island being really feeding a lot on sea otters, and then parts of Glacier Bay as well. Okay, so what does it mean to have this subsidy from the ocean that wolves all of a sudden have available to them, that they've been apart for pretty much the whole scientific record due to the collapse of sea otter populations due to the fur trade, and lots of places where wolves had been extirpated. So the history of this is that wolves colonized Pleasant Island in 2013. It's probably not the first time they've been there. They probably colonized several times or visited the island. It's not that far from the mainland, but they colonized in 2013. And we just happened to be doing this project, and in 2015 had scats, and they're primarily eating deer. And we saw for the first time sea otters. I was like, what? How? Wolves are eating sea otters? This is so weird. By 2016, it was mostly sea otters. And by 2017, it was overwhelmingly sea otters. And then 2018 only, and so on. So there's still now just a tiny amount of deer in their diet. And we can see the same thing with stable isotopes. So these are wolves that were harvested on the island. Well, either harvested or GPS collars were placed on them. So we've got tissues from one of those two avenues. And in 2015, 2016, it's you are what you eat, right? So their isotopic signatures in carbon and nitrogen space is really close to deer. And then there's this huge switch where all of a sudden in 2017, consistent with the metabarcoding, they are switching to feed primarily on sea otters, right, or marine mammals in general, because this method doesn't allow us to deduce which particular species they're feeding on. This is much more refined. So sea otters, not harbor seals, is primarily what they're feeding on. Okay, so at this time, so why the switch? The switch is consistent with a crash in deer pellet group surveys. So in 2018 and 2021 were the first 2 years in the history of the deer pellet group surveys that Alaska Department of Fish and Game does, where there were no deer pellet groups observed. So they've reached an abundance too low to be detected on the island now. And so this change in deer density coincides with this increase in sea otters, which I think is allowing wolves to remain at high density even though deer crashed. So we think of wolves as being obligate ungulate predators, and that their population dynamics are primarily limited by these large herbivores. And so when large herbivores crash, wolf populations follow. But they're able to prey switch to live on this pretty large marine mammal, stay at high density. And I think that's causing the extirpation of deer, which is a pretty interesting thing, because it means that deer are interacting indirectly. Sea otters are interacting indirectly with deer through wolves by supporting wolves. Okay, so far we have no information that this is actually a wolf pack. It could just be a hunting ground. The wolves swim over, spend some time there, and live on the island for a little bit and swim back to the mainland. It's not so far. So we asked that question in two ways. We had 13 GPS collared wolves and 390 scats, and each of those 390 scats was genotyped to identify unique individuals. And so I've got different shades of red and different shades of blue for unique individuals that were detected on Pleasant Island or Gustavus Forelands. And what I want you to take from that is that there have been no mainland wolves detected on the island and no island wolves detected on the mainland. And similarly, the GPS data has not had any movement back and forth. So it is a pack. And there's a wolf pack living on this small island is interesting enough, but that makes them the highest density wolf population ever studied. So there's a high density wolf pack living on this island, and the shades of blue and red here are their home range. So they're living primarily on the margins of this island, right? So we have most of our scats collected from the margins, but that's partially due to effort. The GPS collars corroborate that wolves are just combing the margins, feeding on marine resources. Okay, and they're continuing to reproduce. So the 8 wolves on Pleasant Island in 2020 had 5 pups. So it's not just that they're on the road to extinction. Now the deer are gone, they're continuing to get enough energy to reproduce. So somebody, we now have videos of this ourselves, but somebody posted a video of a camera they put on an otter in Katmai National Park. So scavenging is definitely one of the ways that wolves are getting otters. This is a pretty scrawny looking wolf. They're not all like this in Katmai, we now know. Okay, so we know they're scavenging, and as of this last year, I guess, we now have observations of 3 wolves that caught a sea otter at once and tore it apart. And then those GPS collar wolves are followed around in the Gustavus Forelands and on Pleasant Island. And they found clear evidence that wolves are killing sea otters, but the proportion that are being killed versus scavenged is still unknown. And what are the conditions that allow wolves to be killing sea otters are unknown. But we do know that there's certain haul outs that wolves consistently visit where the otters are on land, and are key places where wolves could have access to them. All right, how much time do I have here?
You have a good maybe half an hour.
All right, I'm talking fast. Okay, so the last section will be about these aquatic jaguars. So sticking with these large-bodied carnivores using aquatic resources. And this is Charlotte Erickson's PhD research, and she's finishing in just a few weeks. So if you're not familiar with the Pantanal, it's like a giant Everglades. It's the largest wetland in the world by far. And it's got drier parts and wetter parts, and we're primarily working in this wet part that's roadless and therefore really hard to work in. So there hasn't been much research here, and that's part of why we don't know a lot about how jaguars live in this primarily aquatic system. And we in particular are working on this place called Taima Island and the surrounding vicinity. It's a fluvial island, meaning the river splits into 2 and then comes back together. There's actually 2 islands here because there's a stream. So it's Taima and Sarare Islands. And so along this island, which is an ecological station that's protected, we use camera trapping and GPS collars on jaguars to learn something about their ecology in this wet part of the northern Pantanal. You can see just water everywhere here. So we were drawn to this because there was just rumors that jaguar density was crazy high here. There have been many jaguar attacks. When people step off the boat, you see jaguar tracks everywhere. And so we wanted to know, well, is it true that jaguar density is unusually high here? And then how can this solitary large-bodied carnivore live at high density? Is something changing about the way they interact spatially or interact socially due to the fact that there's a lot of aquatic resources here? And we wanted to know, well, what are they eating? What's supporting this jaguar population? Okay, so we know a few things about jaguars in the Pantanal, and these are overwhelmingly from the drier southern part of the Pantanal. So here's a study from the southern Pantanal in Brazil. They determined that home range sizes were comparable between the sexes and overlapped little at the core area level. That's what you expect for a jaguar, very little home range overlap. And scat analysis indicated that jaguars relied mostly on large mammalian prey. And in fact, all studies of jaguars at this time suggested that jaguars were primarily fed on mammals across every population, even in the Pantanal. But like I mentioned, this is the drier part of the southern Pantanal. Okay, so here's what we have. We've got cameras all around the island, and then we've got GPS data for male and female jaguars, and the male jaguars cross the island much more. What I want you to see from this is high levels of overlap, even among adult males. So these are in green, yellow, and diamonds, or red, orange, yellow, purple, lots of overlap. So there's not anything resembling discrete home ranges. Similarly, blue and green here, purple, orange. We're missing lots of jaguars, but we can combine inference from telemetry data with GPS collars and camera traps to learn a bit more. So we can watch these jaguars, and they have very small home ranges for a jaguar. I mean, they're just spending a lot of time right along the rivers. They sometimes go, this is at the moment, there's just this one animal collar. Sometimes they go around the lagoons. Some more animals come on air. So we learned here by both GPS collars and with cameras that they're not just using this area seasonally and moving in the wet season or the dry season, because this whole region floods more and then land exposes itself again. So they're resident year round. And our cameras produced a very odd pattern where by far the most common vertebrate detected was jaguar, which is pretty uncommon in when you camera trap, because usually the sort of lower trophic level species are more common, right? You detect more deer or if not deer, some scavenger or generalist type species, not some obligate large body carnivore, which is usually a relatively rare species with a large home range. So already jaguars are dominating what we're detecting. This very small opossum second, and then capybara, ocelots after that, so on. Okay, so we can observe their behavior on these cameras, and it was pretty clear right away that they were fishing. And you can see them carrying fish around. They also carry, oh, well, that's good. There's a lot of videos of multiple jaguars and instances of GPS collar jaguars co-traveling together. And so Charlotte went through all these videos, identified unique individuals, categorized all social interactions. Get pretty lucky sometimes and they just sit right in front of the camera, but there's not that much dry land, so. Maybe give us a few more. Okay, one of the more unique kinds of social interactions that Charlotte classified was social play among adult males. So you've got territorial breakdown, which you also see in coastal brown bears, where they're all feeding on an aquatic resource. You've got a decrease in aggression and social play even among adult males. We don't know at the moment if these are related, but they're definitely not young. Okay, so these are the different classified interactions. So male-male or DEF here. So these are 3 examples of adult male play. There's not as much female-female interaction, quite a lot of female-male interactions, mostly courtship. So that's B and C here. Okay, so we've got this jaguar population. They're overlapping quite a lot. Their territories have broken down. They're engaged in social interactions. Why is this all happening? And it's happening because this jaguar population feeds primarily on fish and caiman. So reptiles, fish, mammals. So mammals are a pretty small part of their diet. Within those reptiles, it's mostly caiman and a little bit of iguana we detected. And then we didn't detect fish to species, so just fish are another really key resource. And then there's a suite of mammals, the most common of which is capybara in their diet and some birds. Okay, but how does this compare to what we know about jaguars? Well, here's a bunch of jaguar populations to date and the proportion of their diet that are mammals, birds, fish, or reptiles. And so there's one study in Manu National Park in Peru that identified substantial reptiles. This is the first one that's not primarily mammals. So you can see between reptiles in red, fish in pink, that covers more than 85% of their diet. So this is a almost fully aquatic resource provisioned jaguar population. And I mean, even though capybara are terrestrial, they spend most of their time in the river. So it's really benefiting from these aquatic resources. Okay, so Charlotte identified all unique individuals based on their pelage. And the idea here was, is this mythology of this crazy place where jaguar density is really high supported by the data? And so we detected 10 of the 11 GPS collared individuals on our camera traps. One of them was a transient female that left the study area. But so few of the individual jaguars we detected were actually GPS collared, which suggested right away that jaguar density must be really high, because even just having 11 jaguars on this island is a lot. But the fact that the vast majority of videos we see are not of our GPS collared individuals suggested density was high. So she detected 69 unique individuals. That's not a census, right? There's individuals we don't know exist in 115 square kilometers. Our density estimate was about 12.4 per 100 square kilometers of this might seem counterintuitive that density is lower than the number of unique individuals, but that's because we're trying to estimate jaguar home range. And so some jaguars spend time outside of the study area. You don't count them as a whole individual. But I think this is quite an underestimate based on some methodological problems when jaguars are using space along linear features like rivers, but we didn't want to bias things in the other direction. Okay, so this is among the highest jaguar densities ever recorded. And what we don't know is this just how it is in northern Pantanal, because there's just no additional studies to tell us if this is just what it's like. This is like Shangri-La for jaguars. They're feeding on aquatic resources, living at really high density, and they've got these changes to territoriality. The next thing we want to know is, how does having so many jaguars, just like having so many bears, affect other parts of the ecosystem? And for that, there's two broad possibilities we're interested in. One is that because jaguars are diverting their feeding to feed on aquatic resources, they're releasing mammals from predation. And the other one is that jaguar population densities are so high that even though they're primarily feeding on reptiles, that's because they've already suppressed the large mammals, right? And initial evidence to me supports this hypothesis too, because we detected so few large mammals that were not jaguar, right? So the idea, this phenomenon is called apparent competition, where two food resources are competing with each other through a shared predator. So that's a possibility. And the way we're going to try to address this is we want to ask, if we add lots of food for the herbivores, will they increase in abundance, or will jaguars keep them low? And the way we're going to add food is a natural experiment where the fires have burnt the canopy. And so I don't know if you remember, but there were these mega fires in 2020 in the Pantanal that burned a huge portion of the biome. And so this is our island right on the edge here. Part of the island was severely burned, part of it was not. And you can see in this severely burned area, trees overwhelmingly died. And those trees in the gallery forest intercept all this light that will now reach the forest floor and grow lots of nutritious vegetation. So we didn't know in the past if these large herbivores were low because jaguars were keeping them low, or if there wasn't enough forage to maintain high densities of these herbivores. So now the forage conditions are changing dramatically with all the tree death, and we hope to see if adding all this forage leads to an increase in large herbivores, or if they are maintained at low density by jaguars. And with that, I will say thank you and take questions.
All right, yeah, Taal, thank you so much for sharing with us. I thought that was incredibly interesting. I am a big fan of bears, but I thought it was a real treat to learn more about the ecological impact of wolves and jaguars as well. I just thought that was so cool. Let me share my screen once more. Okay. So now I'm going to pass it on to our outreach manager, Lucy DeGrace, who will moderate the Q&A portion of the presentation. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat if you haven't already.
Okay, well, there's a couple of questions that have already been posed in there, so go ahead and add if you have more. So the first question that I see in there, Tal, is does the bear's digestion affect the seeds, like make them easier for mice to consume?
No, the seeds come out pretty much intact. There's no detriment to germination and no improvement. That makes it easier for mice to consume in the sense that the fruit is gone, so they don't have to manipulate them, but also they're in these large piles, sometimes tens of thousands of them. So that makes foraging more efficient. But otherwise, each seed itself is not easier to consume. As far as I know, I mean, it's possible mice have an easier time breaking them open, but I don't know of any research suggesting that.
Okay. Kathleen says she thought that the archipelago wolves were nearly hunted out in the last couple of years.
That is in the news because of Prince of Wales Island having very low wolf density. And that's for two reasons. One is lots of old growth forest logging, but more that old growth forest logging requires lots of road building, which has made it easy to access wolves for trapping. So wolf density on Prince of Wales Island is now really low, and that's part of why they're petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. But there's still wolves across the mainland and the archipelago. But yeah, they're hunted quite heavily still. The only place there's no wolves are the ABC Islands, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof, that I'm aware of.
Okay. So Matthew said a little while ago he was having a hard time understanding one of the graphs. I'm not sure, Matthew, if you want to specify which graph you were talking about.
Yeah, I can get to that. I didn't want to go into that too much because I thought I was fitting a lot of stuff in here, but into this talk. But so basically, we're looking at the ratio of carbon isotopes that have carbon 13 relative to carbon 12 and nitrogen 15 relative to nitrogen 14. So it's based on whether they have one extra neutron or not. These are called stable isotopes. They're not radioactive isotopes. And so these are sort of like biological tracers. And so as you go up in the food chain, you accumulate more of the heavier version of nitrogen, delta N15, right? Or more of the heavier version of carbon, but especially nitrogen. And the reason that's important is you can take the hair of an animal or the tissue of an animal and try to understand at what trophic level they're feeding on. And you can relate that specifically to the isotopic composition of their prey. So when they're feeding on herbivores, the food chain is basically like plants, herbivores. But when they're feeding on like harbor seals, you've got harbor seals that are feeding on large fish, that are feeding on small fish, that are feeding on zooplankton, they're feeding on other zooplankton, that are feeding on phytoplankton. So the marine ecosystems have much longer food chain lengths than terrestrial ones. And so you can really trace consumption of marine resources in this way. So the fact that so the wolves are eating sea otters means they have way more heavy nitrogen and heavy carbon. Does that make sense? So the 15 is the sum of the protons and the neutrons of nitrogen, the heavier isotope relative to the lighter isotope.
That relates a little back to what Dave Beatty was saying. He was talking about the role of an important role of bears is to carry carcasses into the riparian zone to fertilize trees and shrubs. And it kind of goes on to talk about the nitrogen and the carbon. We talk about that a lot with growth of trees, but. That's
right. Yep. And I was just on a call this morning with Tom's former student, Chris Daramont, and I've seen Tom talk about that several times. Yeah, this is the salmon fertilization part of bears bringing these carcasses into the forest.
Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anybody else have anything they want to, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question that way, or you're welcome to write it in the chat if you do have questions for Taal.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I hope I didn't talk too fast for you.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, and again, on behalf of Skagit Fisheries and everyone here, it was an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Um, and also many thanks to Lucy and Megan for assisting tonight. And thank you all so much for being here. Before we go, just wanted to plug some upcoming events for this May and June that we'll post the links to as I go through them. So we will be at the Children's Museum this Saturday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for Salmon Day at the museum, where we'll be hosting some games and activities, releasing coho, and hanging out with a special guest, Sammy the Salmon. So make sure you don't miss out. Sammy will also join us at our booth at the Mount Vernon Farmers Market for World Fish Migration Day on Saturday, May 21st at 9 a.m., where we'll be educating the public on the importance of fish migration. If you're interested in attending either of these two events, contact Lucy or Megan. Their emails will be posted in the chat. We'll also be hosting volunteer work parties over the next couple of months at Bowman Bay and Deception Pass State Park, where we'll be doing some beach restoration and maintenance. And then finally, we hope you can join us at Preston Park's ribbon cutting ceremony to celebrate the park's grand opening on Friday, June 10th at 1 p.m. And the link to register for that will be available soon. And then for more info on all these events, you can check out our social media pages, which will also be posted in the chat. Okay, I believe I've covered everything. Again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Taal. And I hope you all have a great night.